Hello Year 9, here is your next lesson on an Inspector Calls. We are up to lesson 9. So again, 3 questions to answer today. So think back to the first week we looked at Inspector Calls. What is an industrialist? And then think about how Mr Birling is presented as an industrialist. The last lesson we looked at omniscient. Think about how the inspector is presented as being omniscient in what we've read so far. And then our new word is scandal. So scandal is an action or event regarded as morally or legally wrong and causing general public outrage. So scandal would be something that someone does wrong and that is made public. And when you were someone of high status, like Mr Birling, for example, other people's opinion of you, your reputation, was really, really important. So a scandal was something you were very afraid of because a scandal would affect your reputation and that could affect your status and other people's opinions of you. So you can pause the video quickly and just write down that definition. So have a go at answering these 3 questions then. Pause the video and then we'll go through the answers together in a minute. So how is Mr Birling presented as an industrialist? Well, we know that he is a prosperous manufacturer from the stage directions. We know that he is a capitalist and holds capitalist views, as demonstrated at many points throughout the play so far. Omniscient. The inspector is omniscient because he appears to deliberately arrive and interrupt Mr Birling's anti-socialist speech. He seems omniscient because he already knows how the Birling family and Gerald are involved in this dead girl's life. He seems to know an awful lot more information than the characters on stage. Mr Birling wouldn't want a scandal because remember he reveals to Gerald that he could get a knighthood as long as none of them get into trouble with the police. And of course a policeman has just arrived. So today we are going to look at explaining how Priestley uses language to compare Mr Birling's capitalist views to the inspector's socialist views. So as I mentioned in an earlier lesson, we have the inspector and Mr Birling on opposite ends of this capitalism versus socialism debate. Mr Birling believes in capitalism, the inspector believes in socialism, and this is because Inspector Goole represents Priestley's views on stage. So J.B. Priestley uses the inspector to put his political views on socialism across to the audience. That's the inspector's purpose, to be like a mouthpiece for J.B. Priestley's views. And we will see Mr Birling and the inspector clash in the bit that we're going to read today. We'll see the power dynamic between them and how these 2 characters' views compare. Okay, and we're going to link all of that to Priestley's intentions. So we are going to read the next section of the play, and we're going to then have a think about Mr Birling's capitalist views and the inspector's socialist views. So as we read the next bit of the play, I want you to think about how Mr Birling appears to be presenting capitalist views and how the inspector either appears to be disagreeing with them or presenting socialist views.
Well, Mr Birling, do you remember Eva Smith now?
Yes, I do. She was one of my employees, and then I discharged her.
Is that why she committed suicide?
Keep quiet, Eric. Don't get excited.
Discharged her means he fired her, just in case you weren't aware.
This girl left us nearly 2 years ago. Let me see, it must have been in the early autumn.
End of September, sir.
That's right.
Look here, sir. Wouldn't you rather I was out of this?
I don't mind you being here, Gerald. And I'm sure you've no objection, have you, Inspector?
Now, this is quite interesting that the first sign of trouble, Gerald wants to leave. He's almost like he's a little bit embarrassed hearing Mr Birling admit to anything. And this shows that Gerald would rather be ignorant to any wrongdoings Mr Birling's done. So he'd rather just not know and bury his head in the sand.
Perhaps I ought to explain first that this is Mr. Gerald Croft, son of Sir George Croft, you know, Crofts Limited.
Mr. Gerald Croft, eh?
We've been celebrating his engagement to my daughter Sheila.
Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Birling?
That's right.
Then I prefer you to stay.
Very well.
Look, there's nothing mysterious about this business. And as it happened nearly 2 years ago, obviously it has nothing whatever to do with the wretched girl's suicide. Eh, Inspector?
I can't agree with you there, sir.
Why not?
Because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards. And what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide. A chain of events.
Now this bit's really interesting, and also the chain of events is really significant because it is in fact a chain of events, as we see. But what's also significant is that Mr Birling is basically saying, oh no, I couldn't have had anything to do with her suicide, and the inspector is straight out disagreeing with him. So he's saying, no, I can't agree with you there. So Priestley is showing that these are two characters with very different views.
Oh, well, put like that, there's something in what you say. Still, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it?
Very awkward.
By Jove.
Now, that's really interesting because Mr Birling is, of course, saying an anti-socialist view there. If we were all responsible for anyone we'd ever had anything to do with, things would be very awkward. And actually, when the inspector says very awkward, he's being sarcastic, because actually, of course, the inspector thinks, well, that is what you need to do. You do need to think about the way you treat people. You do need to think about the consequences of your actions, particularly for those less fortunate than yourself. So again, we see Mr Birling's sort of capitalist views versus Priestley's socialist ones here.
Yes, and as you were saying, that a man has to look after himself.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Now,
it's also interesting there that Eric starts bringing up Mr Birling's every man for himself speech, and even Mr Birling is self-aware enough to actually say, oh yeah, no, Eric, let's not talk about that. So deep down he's aware that attitude is not necessarily something he wants strangers to know.
now, Inspector, about this Eva Smith. I remember her quite well now. She was a lively girl, a good worker too. In fact, the foreman in the machine shop where she worked told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But after they came back from their holidays that August, they suddenly decided to ask for more money. They were averaging about 22 and 6, neither more nor less than is paid generally in our industry. But they wanted the rate raised to about 25 shillings a week. Well, I refused, of course.
Why?
Why?
Yes. Why did you refuse?
Inspector, I don't see that it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business.
It might be.
I don't like your tone. Or all these questions.
So again, we have this difference of opinion here. Mr Birling is trying to defend his decision in the way he treated Eva Smith, and Mr Birling is the inspector is questioning it. Why did you fire her? Why did you behave like this? Again, showing that the inspector disagrees with what Mr Birling has done.
It's my duty to ask questions. So, why did you refuse?
If I'd agreed to this demand for a new rate, we'd have added about 12% to our labour costs. Does that satisfy you?
So the only reason Mr Birling didn't give her a raise and the other girls a raise is because it would make him lose money. It would affect his personal profit, and he can't have that. Now, the moral question you need to ask yourself here, and it's the moral question J.B. Priestley wants us to be considering here. Mr. Birling has plenty of money. The small amount he would lose to give his workers a better wage would not impact on his way of life very much at all. So surely does he not have a moral obligation, a moral responsibility to pay these girls what they are asking for? Now, a socialist like Priestley would say yes, Mr. Birling does have a moral responsibility to not just think about his personal profit and to pay his workers a fair living wage, because we are all, you know, we're all human beings. We're all part of a group of people that should care for one another, not focus on your individual wealth. But of course, Mr. Birling, as a capitalist, views the idea of paying these girls any more money as totally unreasonable. And if they don't like it, they can go work somewhere else, because they will always be replaceable. Because the power is with the rich, not the working class who are desperate for any job that they can get. And it's that power imbalance that a socialist like Priestley is trying to make us aware of here.
We were paying the usual rates, and if they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else. It's a free country, I told them.
It isn't if you can't go and work somewhere else.
Keep out of this, Eric. You hadn't even started in the worst when this happened. So they went on strike.
Now, this is really interesting. Eric is disagreeing with his father. His father's saying, well, it's a free country, you can go work somewhere else. And Eric is saying, well, what if you can't go work somewhere else? What if you can't get another job? So what, you're just forced to put up with it then? So Eric, even despite his privileged upbringing, is empathetic or self-aware enough to realise that actually the inspector's got a point here. So it's really interesting that we see Eric as a member of the younger generation, rather than his dad, who's the older generation, have a more open-minded view here than his father.
That didn't last long, of course.
No, not if it was just after the holidays. They'd all be broke if I know them.
They mostly were. And so was the strike after a week or two. Pitiful affair. Well, we let them all come back at the old rates, except the 4 or 5 ringleaders who'd started the trouble. I went down myself and told them to clear out. This girl, Eva Smith, was one of them. So she had to go.
You couldn't have done anything else.
He could. He could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. I call it tough luck.
Rubbish.
Now that's really interesting. Gerald says Mr. Birling was right. He couldn't have done anything else. Eric says, well, he could have kept them. He could have kept employing them. He thinks it's tough luck. So we have again Gerald siding with Mr. Birling and Eric yet again disagreeing with his father's way of doing things.
If you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'll soon be asking for the earth.
They might. But after all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it.
Now, this is a really important moment as well, because Mr. Birling's saying, well, you know, you can't just let these people get what they want. You've got to show them who's in charge. Otherwise, they might just, you know, they might ask for more. If I give a raise now, they might ask for another raise. You just can't keep giving all the time. And the inspector replies with, well, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. Now, there is a real implied criticism here of capitalists like Mr. Birling. And the implied criticism here is that capitalists do just take what they want. It is all take. It's take for their personal profits. And actually, they are the ones that are wrong.
What did you say your name was, Inspector?
Goole. Goole.
How'd you get on with our Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts?
I don't see much of him.
Perhaps I ought to warn you that he's an old friend, and I see him fairly frequently. We play golf together sometimes.
I don't play golf.
Now, this is really important as well, because what we have here, and remember I talked about the power dynamic between the inspector and Mr Birling. The inspector, with his comment about it's better to ask for the earth than to take it, has really pushed Mr Birling's buttons here. Mr Birling's cross now. So he starts threatening the inspector. He's basically saying to the inspector, I know your boss, Chief Constable Colonel Roberts, the guy in charge of the police. He's my friend. We play golf together sometimes. So his implied threat now to the inspector is, if you don't watch yourself, I could get you fired. Now, what's interesting here is that Mr Birling is proving Priestley's point. He's proving how immoral people, capitalists like Mr Birling, are. So he doesn't like the fact that the inspector is questioning him. So he's threatening to use his power to get him fired. So Mr Birling is trying to assert his dominance here as the more powerful person.
I didn't suppose you did.
Well, I think it's a damn shame.
Well, I never wanted to play.
I mean about this girl. I don't see why she should have been sacked just because she'd a bit more spirit than the others. I'd have let her stay.
Unless you brighten your ideas, you'll never be in a position to let anybody stay or tell them to go. It's about time you learned to face responsibilities. That's something this public school and varsity life you've had doesn't seem to teach you.
Well, we don't need to tell the inspector all about that, do we?
Now, this is interesting as well, because Eric, yet again, is disagreeing with his father. And Mr Birling, again, now turns his anger on Eric. And he basically says, well, unless you change your views, I agree with me, you're not going to be in a position to inherit the business. Because remember, Eric's his heir. Eric will inherit the factories. And what Mr Birling then does is insults Eric, basically. Now, remember, Eric would have had everything given to him by Birling. Eric would have had a good education. He would have had, a generous allowance to live off. And remember, Mr Birling probably didn't get that when he was Eric's age. Mr Birling had to almost make his own way in the world. And there's a real implied criticism of his own son here, that actually he looks down on Eric because Eric has had everything given to him, even though Mr Birling is the one that's given it to him. And he expects Eric to be very, very grateful for this and to have his side. So he doesn't like this idea of his son disagreeing with him, certainly not in front of the inspector.
I don't see that we need to tell the inspector anything more. In fact, there's nothing I can tell him. I told the girl to clear out. She went. That's the last I heard of her. Huh. What happened to her after that? Go on the streets, did she?
Not exactly.
What's this about?
So we're going to stop there because next we have Sheila enter that we will look at next week. So I'm going to load the PowerPoint back up and we're going to answer some questions about what we've just listened to. This is a really, really important, there's some very important ideas that Priestley has presented us with here. So what I'd like you to do is just make some notes on these following questions. So how does Priestley show Mr Birling's capitalist views? How does Gerald agree with them? How does Eric disagree with them? And why might the fact that Eric disagrees be significant? Okay, so pause the video here and just make some notes. What do we learn about Mr Birling's capitalist views? How does Eric agree? How does Gerald agree? And how does Eric disagree? Okay, so pause the video and answer those questions. So Mr Birling's capitalist views then. He believes that going on strike is idiotic and pathetic. He believes that he doesn't have to pay his workers a fair wage and they have no right to ask for a better wage. If they don't like the wage that they are paid, they can go and work somewhere else because he knows he will always be able to find cheap labour to work in his factories. We know that he would never entertain the idea of giving them a raise because all he cares about is his personal profit. We've also seen this idea that he's not afraid to abuse his status by threatening essentially to get the inspector fired or in trouble if he doesn't start being a little bit more polite to him. So we see Gerald agree with everything Mr Birling says, and Gerald would have done the same thing in Mr Birling's position. Now this is interesting because we know that Gerald's father also owns a factory, and that Gerald will eventually inherit the factory as well. We also know that Gerald is an aristocrat. Eric, however, disagrees. Several times Eric says that he would have behaved differently, and this is significant because what it's showing is again another divide in this family. The fact that there are issues and there is tension between Eric and Mr Birling. But equally, we're showing this divide between the older generation, Mr Birling, and the younger generation, Eric. What's interesting is, despite being a member of Eric's generation, Gerald is in fact siding with Mr Birling. And Priestley could be doing this to show that the aristocrats, regardless of age, because of their immense wealth and privilege, are always going to essentially be capitalists. So, we're going to think now then about the inspector's socialist views. How does Priestley show the inspector's socialist views here? So think about the fact that the inspector is lower middle class and should therefore speak to Mr Birling as if he is superior to him. How does the inspector speak to Mr Birling? Why do you think Priestley has done this? So again, pause the video and make some notes on how Priestley shows us that the inspector is a socialist. So we see that the inspector is a socialist because he disagrees with several things that Mr Birling says, and he questions him, showing that he disagrees with those points. He asks why he refused to give Eva Smith a raise, as if Mr Birling really should have given her a raise. He questions and challenges Mr Birling on his view that Mr Birling has nothing to do with her suicide. He mentions that actually it could have led to a chain of events. The firing of Eva Smith could have led to a chain of events that led to her suicide, which is showing this socialist view of collective responsibility, of us all being responsible for one another. We see as well the fact that the inspector isn't afraid of Mr Birling's status. Even when Mr Birling starts threatening the inspector with knowing his boss, Chief Constable Colonel Roberts, the inspector doesn't change the way that he speaks to him. He continues to be assertive, he continues to be intimidating, he continues to be strong and forceful. So he is not intimidated. And Priestley has done this to show that socialism is a powerful force and socialism is morally right, and therefore, despite being socially inferior to Mr Birling, the inspector is almost powered by this idea of morally being in the right. And we admire the inspector, or we're supposed to admire the inspector anyway, for the fact that he has the courage to stand up to someone like Mr Birling. So what I'd like you to do is write a paragraph explaining the answer to this question. How does Priestley contrast the views of Mr Birling and Inspector Goole? So you could include in your paragraph what Mr Birling's views are, and summarise them quickly. What Inspector Goole's views are, and summarise those. Who seems to have the power or the dominance, or is it one character, or does it tend to flick between the two? And how are their views similar or different? Okay, so you're thinking about how Priestley contrasts the views of Mr Birling and the inspector, and writing a paragraph explaining those ideas. So you can pause the video now and answer those questions. And then finally, we have our final feedback. So do you think Mr Birling's actions could cause a scandal? So he's fired this girl, and refused to give her a raise. Do you think that would be scandalous? Do you think, and think about Gerald's reaction to saying he doesn't seem shocked. But if people of Mr Birling's opinion, fellow capitalists, wouldn't find it scandalous, does Priestley want the audience to find it scandalous and wrong? So that's what I want you to think about. And again, how is Mr Birling presented as an industrialist, as a capitalist? Okay. Well done. That is the work that you have completed so far, and then you will get an email from your teacher tomorrow telling you what to do in your independent lesson.